Hi, I'm your host, Anand J. Sukhadia, and this is the Limitless One podcast. Join me on this journey as I interview the most inspirational souls who are tapping into their limitless blueprint on a mental, physical, and spiritual level to thrive in uncertain times. If you feel you are so much more than just this body, just this life, and want to tap into your limitless potential, you're in the right place. Here we go, starseeds. Are you seeking to understand why life throws certain challenges your way? Sometimes over and over and over. Each one of us is here on Earth to unlock our superhero powers, yet some of us just haven't tapped into this innate potential. Today's guest is here to help us with this transformation by sharing her amazing story. Welcome to the Limitless One podcast. I am your host, Anand J. Sukhadia. Our guest, Zofia Rennea Morales, is an award-winning global strategist and former biophysicist. She had it all: a high-powered career, loving husband, gorgeous properties, adventure, good friends, you name it. She was living the dream until her fast-paced life screeched to a halt and left her in pieces. This single prayer triggered an unanticipated kundalini awakening, a spiritual activation that unlocked Zofia's gifts as an intuitive, healer, mystic that changed her life completely. Zofia is now the host of the talk radio program Sovereign Self and creator of the Conscious Enlightenment Process. Welcome to the Limitless One podcast, Zofia Rennea Morales. Thank you so much for coming on today.
I'm very excited to be here as well.
This is our first time that we're going to be speaking, and I'm getting to know you, but I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts. I was really impressed by your energy and your purposeful life, and I love people with a great story. So I'd love to learn more about that. But before we start, I wanted to ask you, what does living a limitless life mean to you?
It means unlearning a bunch of stuff that I learned growing up, first of all. And it means really stepping into the acceptance of me being part of oneness, being part of source, God, creator, whatever name you want to put on that. Because that's when the limits really start to melt away. But I find it tends to be this multi-phase process because there's this layers of stuff that has been put on us to keep us in separation. It's like the virtual reality equipment that we're sent with when we embody.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to, take off the gloves and the headsets and all of the things that take you into separation so that you can see the truth of what's behind all of this, which is we are all oneness. We are all divine, deep in our core. Some of us, it's just buried much deeper than others.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting perspective because it starts to really pull you out of judgment. And you have to be in a judgment-free place, I think, really to wholeheartedly, completely step into the limitless aspect.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Yeah, that judgment prevents us so much, like you were saying, like we're all one. And, these meat suits, our skin color, the politics of the day, everything in society is designed to show us that we are separate. And that's the biggest illusion I think that this world has. And if we can, cut that with a knife and understand that, yeah, when we release judgment on ourselves, first of all, because any kind of insecurities about others always stem from what are we lacking, or the thoughts are going on in ourselves. So the inner world
And
matches.
hang on, I want to kind of pinpoint that a little bit
Yeah.
because that's a huge first step that can be an amazing tool for you as you're moving forward.
Mm.
I know it is for me on a regular basis, is kind of watching my thoughts and noticing when those judgment things pop up, because they do, right? You'll be watching the news and it's like, oh my God, I can't believe that person, whatever.
Mm.
Okay. Now it's time for you to turn that around and look at yourself and go, what is it in me that makes me judge that person? Because that's the next thing that's up for you to work on.
Yeah, beautiful.
And
And everything is a mirror. Everything, everyone that you see on the outside, you're looking at through your foggy goggles, right? If they are foggy or if they're loving, right? So everyone can be your enemy, or everybody can be your soulmate in many ways. So it's important to really look within first, because yeah, we are the creators of our universe, and if each one of us are our own universe, we're co-creating at the same time. So
yeah.
it'll be a beautiful day, and I hope to see it in my lifetime when that fog is lifted and everyone sees the beauty within each other.
Yeah, and if you pay attention to your life, I know looking back even on the moments before I awakened, there would be these moments of, what I wanna say, time out of time almost, because many years before I awoke, I was carjacked, and I'd gone to Walmart, I'm loading my stuff in the car, I get in the car, and somebody gets into the passenger seat next to me. Now, your first reaction to that as a human being is, "What the fuck? Who are you? Get the hell out of my car," right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the normal response, and I opened my mouth to do that, and this calm, this great peace calm came over me that kinda pushed my personality and that reaction to the side, and I looked at this person and I said, "Are you all right? How can I help you?" Which was not my first reaction. And I don't think it wasn't a reaction that came from my personality level, the incarnated aspect of myself. I think this was my higher self stepping in and going, "You don't wanna go down that road. This is gonna work out better." And I can remember it was like 2 of me in my body as I was going through this experience, and this calm wise part of myself that had arrived kept prompting my personality, "Well, ask him about himself. Ask him, what it is that he needs. Find out more about what's going on in his life." And so
Mm-hmm.
he's telling me this story about his girlfriend is in the hospital, they're new in town, she's delivering their first child, and so I'm asking him all the questions you ask somebody in that "Have you chosen a name? Are your parents excited to be grandparents?" That kind of thing. And the personality part of myself is seeing the discontinuities in his story because he's making it up as he goes along. He's lying to me.
Yeah.
And my personality knows that he's lying to me and really wants to call him on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the wise part of me that has arrived is like, hush, it doesn't matter whether he's telling you the truth or not. What matters is that you connect with him and you really see him as a human being. And he's giving me directions, this guy who's new to town, giving me directions purportedly to the hospital. Now, I've lived in this place for quite a while, so I know that's not where the hospital is,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm following all the directions, and he directs me into this closed, abandoned gas station parking lot, the dark side next to the building. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is not a good situation. And the wise part of me reminds me that I've got like 60 bucks in my checking account that I'd set aside to give to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked at him and I said, I would not like to leave you out here in this dark place. I would be concerned for your safety. And I know that you probably have need of some extra money because of this child coming into the world, blah, 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 blah. Got this money I was going to donate to the church. Let's cut out the middleman.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where there's an ATM? And he's like, oh, yes. And so he gives me directions to the ATM. I take out the $60 and I hand it to him. And I ask him if he wants me to take him back to that parking lot. And he says, oh, no, no, no. And he directs me to a little better section of town at the corner under a street light. And he gets out and he leaves. And it was like, wow, that was really interesting experience. The instant he got out of the car, like, the wise aspect of me took off. Um, and it was really profound because I know when he got in that car, none of that was his intention. So something shifted for him in those moments of being the center, the most important person in my world in that moment, and receiving what do I want to, for lack of a better word, loving attention from someone.
Wow. I think that's really what so many people seek. You know, anyone who inflicts pain or is intending to inflict pain, it's because they're in pain, and you're almost like shocking him with being loving rather than being, oh, don't hurt me, don't hurt me. You're seeing how you can be of service in that moment, because yeah, we're all in crazy situations every day. This one is obviously very extreme, and for you to have that insight, it's almost like you had an activation, but on some level you activated him to flip the heart from being closed to being open, and now he looked after you to, you know, bring you back to a place that was a little bit safer, and then he simply walked away rather than going with his, who knows what his
Whatever the
initial.
original
Yeah.
plan was, right? Yeah, I
Yeah.
never saw what he had in his hand next to the
Mm.
seat or any of that because it was clear he was hiding something. Um, but the other thing that was, I think, really a blessing about that situation that was unexpected to me is so many people after an event like that would walk around traumatized and freaking out every time they were getting in their car in a dark parking lot. And I had none of that. And put it down to the fact that my higher self came in and completely took the wheel. There was none of that, what I want to say, adrenaline reaction
Hmm.
that would have created those PTSD kind of pathways in my brain. This is a scientist discussing it again now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I walked away from it completely unscathed as well.
Amazing. So the entire time there was no physiological reaction on your part in terms of elevated heart or, you know,
Or
cortisol
and
release or any of
yeah,
that stuff.
no, it was this complete calm and comfort and knowing that everything would be completely okay the entire way through it,
Wow.
which yeah, wow is right. It was really, really profound. And in fact, had completely forgotten about the incident for several years, until I was in outside sales and Walmart again, what is it with Walmart parking lots?
Because stay away from that place.
It was Walmart again, and I came out and there were several people panhandling in front of this Walmart, and it's just like, "No, sorry," and I kept on walking. And this particular gentleman took offense to the fact that I had chosen not to stop and engage with him, and followed me back to my car, and he had other people with him, and they were doing this, aggressive stuff for my perceived rudeness. And I got in my car and I drove away, and I told my girlfriend about it later. And she's like, "Oh my God, you could have been hurt. You could have been killed, all the coulda, wouldas." And it was in that moment that I was reminded of the initial carjacking back in the day, which was probably actually on its face a more threatening situation than these guys even following me back to my car, which was what brought it back into my conscious memory. I'm like, "Oh, wow, okay." And that's probably part of the reason I wasn't especially panicked when I was getting hassled the second time. It's like, I everything's fine. I'm not
Mm.
there's nothing for me to be worried about here, I guess, was the attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. And going through things like that, then it gives you perspective in the future in every situation. It could be a minor one or a major one, knowing that you'll be okay as long as you know, keep aligned with that highest truth of yours, which is compassionate compassion and, you know, higher love for everyone, even if they can't see it themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And even just holding it when you do have to say no. On that particular day, I was on a timetable that needed to be met, and it's like, "No, I don't have time to interact with you. I'm not in a position to interact with you." And I didn't, what do I want to say? At my core, I didn't feel like this was a circumstance I was supposed to be engaged with, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. And so I didn't. And that's okay. There are moments when no is the appropriate response.
Hmm. Absolutely. Holding your boundaries for sure. Zofia, can you tell us a little bit about your background? I would love to know how you became Zofia standing here today and your spiritual and kundalini awakening that you've had.
Yeah, that's a much bigger story.
Mhm.
If we're going all the way back to my
Mhm.
childhood, we all come into this world, what do I want to say, turned on to some degree or another. If you watch small children, there are no atheist children. We all, on some level, remember the unconditional love, the beauty of what's on the other side, the magic, and we look for the magic in the day to day as kids. But it's oftentimes trained out of us, and sometimes pretty extremely trained out of us. And I was raised in a very conservative Lutheran household. There was no drinking, there was no dancing, and anything that was remotely miraculous was considered to be of the devil because that doesn't happen anymore. This is what
Mhm.
I was raised with. Jesus was the last one that worked any miracles on earth, and forget about it. Anything else is of the devil. And so I had prescient dreams as a child, and it scared me so much that I had to shut it down because I was very concerned about my family completely rejecting me, or worse yet, trying to have an exorcism or something crazy like that because I'm having these prophetic dreams. And so I shut it down, and I shut it down really hard as a child.
How old
And
were
it
you when you had the awareness that you had these visions and these ideas, these dreams, and then you knew that your parents or your family weren't going to be accepting of it? Like, how do you like navigate that as a young child?
Yeah, I was, like, 1st grade, so what's that, 7 years old, 8 years old, something like that. Initially, I was having them, but not telling anyone I was having them. That was the first step, and then it got to the point, it's like, "I've gotta tell somebody," and I told a classmate of mine who is about my age. I'm like, This is really weird. This is what's going on." And she really freaked out, which I think is what took it to the level of freak out for me, and the realization that a lot of bad stuff can probably come out of this. And so it was in that moment that I made this, it was like a full being commitment to not doing that, and the dreams stopped. They went away. And I don't think it shut down all of my spiritual superpowers, if you will, because I've always just known the answers to things. They call it claircognizance.
Hmm.
Um, and that one didn't get shut off, but that one I could kind of explain away because I was a really bright kid and a voracious reader. And so if somebody ever asked me, well, how do you know that? It would be like, well, I must have read it somewhere, right? And so I was able to kind of palm it off that way. And my parents were very focused on, they okay, let's put it this way, they could have been Oriental parents. "You will get an education, and you will get a high degree, and you will go out and be like a doctor," or, something like that. Doctors, lawyers, that kind of thing. That was their objective.
I know it all
And
too well.
I had a feeling you would probably resonate with that kind of parenting.
Yeah.
And, so I knew from kindergarten. I can remember walking home from kindergarten trying to figure out how many years it was gonna be before I graduated from high school, and I knew college was at least, like, 3 or 4 years beyond that, and so I figured I would probably be, like, the old age of 20 by the time I had all this done.
Hmm.
And thinking, "Oh my god," it's so much. Um, but I knew from that moment that I was supposed to put myself through school. My parents were very clear that I needed to go on scholarship because they didn't have the money to send me. And so it's not just get good grades, it's get the best grade because you're gonna have to outcompete all these other kids when it comes to applying to school. And so that was like the focus of my life. And the farther I went through the educational process, um, the fewer friends I had, because I've got to outcompete all my classmates, and they don't like that. It does terrible things for your socialization in school. And the other thing was, it took me farther away from that connectedness with source, that spontaneous inspiration kind of stuff. And I can remember by the time I was in high school, I even the claircog stuff had started to go down and tail off. And that was the one that I hadn't deliberately shut down. So I was doing a good job of disconnecting from oneness. And I went through college and I graduated and I went on to grad school to study biophysics. So yeah, uber nerd over here. And I did it all on scholarship and fellowship. And it was a financial blessing, but it was not a social blessing. And by the time I got into young adulthood and out into my career, I was completely humanistic. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's got to be replicatable. I've got to see the proof. We have to be able to measure to be able to say that it's truth or untruth. And anything that was remotely colloquial or word of mouth was completely dismissed by me. And so that's where I kind of started the actual journey back from, was this extreme scientific, rational, logical mind kind of position. And when your soul wants you to wake up, it will make sure that you wake up. And it'll start with, what I want to say, small, gentle nudges and this sort of thing, people telling you stories. My mother-in-law from my second marriage, my current marriage, is a very fae kind of person. She is connected to the angels. She sees miracles all over the place. And I love her to death. She is so sweet and so loving and so wonderful, and so the opposite of my biological mother,
Mhm.
accepting of all kinds of things. Um, and she was extremely loving and accepting of me. And I did not, what do I want to say? I did not verbally share my reactions to her thanking her angels for parking spots right in front of the door.
Mhm.
I was like, okay, yes, that's nice. I love you, and I'm not going to make fun of you or mock you for that.
Mhm.
Um, and so we've always gotten along very well. And she turned out to be a huge blessing to me ultimately in my journey. But that's where I started from. And my husband is also very logical and rational minded, not to the same extreme I was, but we're compatible. He's also a scientist. He's also an uber nerd.
Mhm.
um, and so I was getting these small invitations. My mother-in-law was a small invitation that I kind of walked past. People tell stories of waking up. There was this book that fell off the shelf in front of me in the bookstore, or hit me on the head or whatever, right? And sure, I had some jumping books, and I would put them back on the shelf and go, I wish these people would shelve the books better. And so when you don't take the little invitations, you start to get bigger invitations. And I started to get very ill. I'd been very ill for a while, but it started to become troublesome. I started really actively trying to look at what was going on. And it started, what do I want to say, innocuously enough, it's the I'm tired. I'm tired all the time. And it started quite a few decades ago. So they didn't have as many options for why you might be tired all the time. Um, but over the years, I would go back to the doctor and complain about, well, it feels like somebody's thrown another rock into my back sack every year, and it's just that much harder to schlep this thing through the world. And it seems to be harder for me than it is for people who are also my age, my peers. It's more like I'm a couple decades older than I actually am in a lot of ways. And I can remember having this conversation with my mother, who's 30 years older than I am. And I was saying, well, I've got this happening and that happening and the other thing happening. And she's like, you've got more ailments than I have, and I'm 70. Like, this is not a good situation. And the thing that really amped up the search on that front was I started to forget things. Not like I put down my keys and I don't remember where I put them, or my glasses or whatever, because I set them down without presence of mind when I did it. I'm forgetting words. I'm walking into not just walking into the room, but I'm walking into the room and starting to do why I came into the room, and I forget why I'm there doing what I'm doing. This is, you know, 90-year-old people stuff. This
Mhm.
is not 40-year-old forgetfulness. Entire words. My husband would come home and say, "What happened today?" And I could not tell him anything that happened today. Or if I did remember what happened, I didn't have the words to describe what happened any longer at really scary, forgetful stuff. I describe it like you go to the garage. Oh, I'm going to go get something from the garage. You open up the door where the garage ought to be, and the garage is gone. It's just blank. Okay, fine. I'm going to go back where I went, where I was. I close the door and turn around to go back in the house, and the house is gone now too. That's the kind of forgetfulness we're talking about here,
Mhm.
and it's very concerning. And so I'm ramping up my efforts to figure out what's going on. And I've gotten a lot of diagnoses of this thing or that thing. And it's like, yeah, you've got some high cholesterol, but we'll figure that out. Your blood sugar's a little off. We'll figure that out. You've got some food allergies, you need to avoid a few things. But it's not fixing the problem. I'm still exhausted as heck, and it's getting worse because I'm catching every little thing that goes around. And it's gotten to the point I don't even have to leave the house for that to happen. My husband will come home from work with something. He won't catch it, but he'll give it to me, and I'll be out for weeks. And so I'm getting to the point that this big, beautiful, logical minded brain of mine is completely going to pieces. And I'm sick so often I can't hold down a job. Employers, they think, 6 or so days of sick time a year, that's about right. Well, I was blowing through that in a month,
Mhm.
and that's not a good situation to be in. And so it's like keep searching for answers. And I am looking for more. At first, I looked for more specialized doctors, but then I had this realization that they're in silos. And my problem is not a silo kind of problem, it's an overall, more holistic kind of thing. And so I started looking at, well, what kind of doctors look at the whole organism and are more specialized than a general practitioner, which is what you typically see. And I discovered functional medicine doctors.
Mhm.
Okay, fabulous. I'm going to go find me one of those. Well, at that point, the money went away because things have been changing in my husband's industry. And it's getting harder for him to find a job, and the jobs that he finds are getting shorter. And this gets really hard on the finances in a hurry, especially when the other partner can't work and is sick, because sick
Mhm.
sucks up more money than healthy.
Yeah, and no insurance for that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
back at the time that he started losing his job on a fairly regular basis, it was before there was Obamacare, and they had to cover pre-existing stuff.
Mhm.
And so I'm accumulating all kinds of pre-existing stuff, so the insurance is working less and less well,
Yeah.
because they're like, "Well, we already know you have high cholesterol, so we're not covering anything for that, and we know you've got high blood sugar, we're not gonna cover any of that." And so they start checking all of this stuff off. We're not covering the allergy stuff. And so it becomes increasingly financially burdensome. And so when he re enters his employment, it's harder for us to dig out from under the financial pile of stuff that has piled up, right? And so our savings is going down with each of these, and it's not coming back as fast. as it had previously. And so we're in this financial death spiral in a lot of ways. And we had moved out to Arizona for a job that was supposed to be 3 to 5 years for him. And the pay on it was good. It was a project he was excited about, that he thought he could make a difference with. There's immediately started to be some like red flag things with that position after he started it, because they were really weird about the money side of things. They told him, well, we've raised, 20 million to do this drug project. He does drug development. And 20 million, yeah, you can get somewhere with that in drug development. It's not going to get you all the way, but it'll get you to a point where you can get a larger partner with deeper pockets to take it
Mhm.
over the line. They were giving him little tiny drips of money. It's like, oh, well, you can have $5,000 to go do this. He's like, it's a $40,000 project.
Mhm.
$5,000 isn't going to do anything on this. And after 12 months, they finally came clean with him and told him that they had spent almost all of their 20 million before they brought him on board, and had goose eggs to show for it.
Wow.
And we were given 1 month's notice that they would downsize him. And so at that point, we had some serious conversations that had to be had, because it was clear that his industry had changed in such a profound way that he needed to change his qualifications in order to get the kind of jobs that he needed to have. And so he's debating, do I get a Juris Doctor? Do I get an MD? What do I put with this? Should it be an MBA? What's it going to be? At the same time as we're going, well, what are we going to do? Because our income is at zero. We haven't managed to build our savings up at all to speak of. I can't work. What are we going to do? And we came to the conclusion that it had to be bankruptcy, because you can't budget zero. There's just nothing you can do with that.
Mhm.
And we really didn't have savings to speak of, because it was all debt still from the relocation that had brought us out there, and my own health stuff. So there's nothing left to do. There were
Mhm.
no other options. And I had always thought of bankruptcy as committing bankruptcy, like I'm stealing from someone.
Mhm.
And so my willingness and desire to embrace this solution is zero. I don't like the idea at all,
Mhm.
but I don't see an alternative. So we made an agreement as a couple that that's what we're going to do, and we're not going to hide it. Or if anyone needs to know, we will absolutely let them know this is the circumstances we're in and why we're here. And it's not that we did anything wrong or deliberately set out to, run up a bunch of debt and then drop it on, banks and creditors and stuff. It just, life took us that way. And so I went looking for a bankruptcy attorney, and he decided he needed an MBA. So we looked for an MBA program at the same time. Now, these are mutually exclusive things to my mind, right?
Mhm.
Because it takes money to get an MBA. They aren't cheap. And when you're in bankruptcy, if you have any money at all, the trustee gets all of it to settle what they can of your debts.
Mhm.
And you can't take out any loans or do any of that kind of thing while you're in bankruptcy. So I have no clue how we're supposed to do both of these things at the same time, but it's quite clear that this is what has to happen. And I was led to a bankruptcy attorney, and I say led to because there there are dozens of them in our area. And generally attorneys are very responsive, right? There was only one that responded to any of my inquiries. And so I don't think that's an accident. I think it's
Yeah.
because he was the one we were supposed to be working with,
Mhm.
and he turned out to be absolutely brilliant at what he did. And this is kind of the beginning of what I call my running at walls set of lessons, because a lot of times your soul journey is completely illogical, but it's the direction you're supposed to go. And I call it running at walls because I've discovered the faster I go down that road towards that brick wall, the sooner I discover that A, the brick wall is not a thing, or B, there's a sharp left turn right before I get to it that I couldn't have seen from any other angle than right up there pressed against that wall. And so we went down this road of getting him an MBA and declaring bankruptcy at the same time. And the lawyer didn't even bat an eye because you have to give him your whole financial picture and everything. And he's like, well, here's what you're going to do. And so he gave us the directions for how we could access some of our retirement money to pay that first trimester's worth of tuition without the trustee gaining the right to then access the rest of it. Because if you approach that incorrectly, the trustee can then seize what they would not have otherwise been entitled to seize. And so he had an answer for that. And I'm like, wow, okay, so we'll go do that. And we got my husband started on the degree program. We still have zero income because he still hasn't found a job. But the lawyer was like, I know you'd really like to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. That's the one where they just go in with a big eraser and go, okay, it's all gone, move on with your life. He said the problem with that is the trustee for that kind of bankruptcy here in our county has made it a specialty of his to bust into retirement accounts. And so if you go down that road, I promise you he will do everything within his power to take every cent that you have. And I'd like to see you at least leave with what you've set aside for retirement. Okay, so what do you suggest? I want you to go Chapter 13, which is a payer bankruptcy, which means you have to have income, which we don't have. I'm like, okay, fine, we'll do that. What number are we aiming for? You know, what would be kind of an optimal amount of income? And he said, you need to have less than 50,000 or less a year, because that'll get you the shortest payer bankruptcy you can have. Like, okay. And so I went home and I told my husband what the dealio was there. And he's like, okay, I don't know where we're coming up with it, but we'll continue this as a plan. And it was shortly after that conversation, he was invited to help out a buddy of his who was doing a professional conference, happened to be back in the place we had just moved from. And my husband's like, yeah, I'll come along and help you man your booth. No big deal. And the dude was like, I'll pay your airfare and your hotel and your food. Just help me out. And that works out well for my husband because now he's in a place where people who need his services are all congregated.
Mm-hmm.
So he went
Put
and did
yourself in the position that you want to be in, right? Put yourself amongst those people.
exactly. And so he's like, I will go and do that. No big deal. And he came back from that professional conference with a job at exactly $50,000 a year. Back in the place that we had just come from, which is the other running at walls situation. Because when you're in bankruptcy, if you change states, you end up under a different set of rules. And as it was, we were having to run out the clock a little bit to get the Arizona rules. If we both moved back to Indiana, now we're starting over again under a whole new set of rules. And so it's clear that we both can't go, but I talked to the attorney and he's like, it only requires one of you to be in Arizona. The other one can be wherever. So, okay, we're going to send my husband back to Indiana. I don't know how he's going to live or survive in Indiana because all of the money is already allotted within the bankruptcy. You know, it's this amount for your housing and it's this amount for your food and it's this amount for your medical. And there's anything beyond that, the trustee gets. So I have no idea how we're going to have two households, but it's clear that he has to go get this job if we're going to have the money for the bankruptcy. So we send him on out there. And I was in outside sales. That was my last position in that state. And so I had a bunch of email addresses. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to send an email to everybody that I ever knew back there and find out if somebody's got a guest room he can crash in for a while. You know, just give him a shelf in the refrigerator, place to park the car, and Wi-Fi. That's what he needs. And so I sent an email off to everybody that I knew describing our situation, asking for that. And oh, by the way, he's deathly allergic to cats. So if you have a cat, we
You
can't
got to get rid
accept.
of it.
We can't accept, right? And basically, I said, "Tell me how much you want for that. I recognize that this is not like a favor. This is like you need to be compensated for
Mhm.
this." And so I sent that off to everybody that I knew. And of course, I got a bunch of, "Well, we're terribly sorry to hear that. We can't help you," or "We just moved our niece into the guest room," this kind of thing. And then I got one that I totally didn't expect. I got one that said, "I have an empty condo that I cannot rent out because it's in an over 55 community, and I'm prohibited from doing that. I cannot sell it because it's completely upside down, and I can't keep up with this empty condo because I've got too much stuff going on in my life. It would help me tremendously if he would live there and keep it up. All he needs to do is pay the utilities." That's my price point.
Yeah.
0. And so we had a place for him to live against all odds, and a much better place for him to live than just somebody's spare bedroom. He's got the whole place to himself, total privacy. You don't have to worry about disturbing anybody else's rhythms or habits. And it's like, wow, this is incredible. And we got some health insurance out of the deal because the job that he got has health insurance. The problem with the health insurance, though, is it only covers people in Indiana, which is the state that we're sending him back to. Well, doesn't help me much yet. But we finally did get the bankruptcy filed, and my dad agreed to pay for the moving truck for me to go and be with my husband once we had the bankruptcy filed. And so, okay, now I can look for a doctor to figure out what's going on with me. And so I started to look for what I describe as a zebra. I looked for a functional medicine doctor who would take insurance, which they're few and far between because they tend to run tests that the insurance company is like, "Yeah, no, we're not paying for that." And so most of them have decided they just don't want to fight with the insurance company to try to get things covered. And so the majority of functional medicine doctors out there are like, "No, this is the price. It's cash pay. We don't mess with insurance. You can try and get it reimbursed from your insurance if you want, but we don't play that game." Well, I found one who did take insurance. And so I went to see him. It was a very useful experience. I found a bunch of stuff that I didn't know previously. I managed to get off antidepressants because we discovered I have what they call a methylation defect. Methylation is how your body turns on and off different biochemical reactions in your system. So it'll upregulate certain hormones, it'll downregulate other hormones, and it is the power and control basically. And it turns out that the switch to regulate my feel good hormones in my brain is what's broken. And that's why I've been on antidepressants for so much of my life. And the good news is you can fix that, right? Because if your DNA is messed up, this is like the building plan filed with the county is wrong. Okay. But you can easily fix that by producing a copy, the RNA, that's used on site. You give a corrected copy to the engineer on site, the construction manager on site, and they'll build it properly if you give them a corrected copy. And so that's what RNA is. It's like the corrected copy. And you can get that as drops under your tongue. Yay. But it didn't fix any of the problems that were really plaguing me. I was still getting sick. I'm still exhausted. I'm still all those things. But I do love that I'm off the antidepressants.
That's
And
a
so
big one.
he checked a bunch of other stuff, and it didn't come back as anything significant. And so he sat me down and he says, "Well, I think we're going to have to retest you for Lyme," because I'd been tested for Lyme disease previously and had shared that with him. And the Lyme disease test came back negative. And the approved Lyme disease test has a problem with it. that most doctors don't understand. And so the doctor who'd run it probably didn't even realize this problem. You tend to think if you go in to get a test, if it's yes, it's yes. If it's no, it's no. And there are two things that are needed to make a test fit that conceptualization. The first one is that it needs to be extremely specific. So if it comes back with a yes, it is yes for that specific thing. It's not yes for something that's kind of similar to it. And Lyme disease is good with that one. That test is very specific. If it comes back as Lyme disease, it absolutely is Lyme disease and nothing else. But the thing that Lyme disease is not good on is a thing they call sensitivity. And that is important because you want a test that's sensitive enough to find really, really low levels of disease in order to make sure you don't have it. If you have to be in a condition where there's a lot of it floating around for it to come back positive, that leaves you in a circumstance where you can be tested for it. It can come back negative, and yet you still have it. And that's the problem with the Lyme disease test. It's not sensitive enough to pick it up in certain stages of the disease because Lyme has 3 different forms that it can take in your body. And the test is only going to detect one of those. And so if your disease is not in that stage primarily, it won't see it. I'm like, ew. Okay, so how do we find out if we really have Lyme? Well, there are a couple of other tests for Lyme that look for the other 2 stages. And those aren't the ones that are accepted by the CDC, but they are accurate and they do help doctors actually determine that you have Lyme, just the other 2 forms. Okay, great. So we ran those tests and it came back that I have Lyme disease. Those 2 were both screamingly positive. And so fabulous. I've got the answer now to what has been eating my brain because Lyme is a relative of syphilis. And if you remember high school health, untreated syphilis will literally eat your brain. And that's
Mhm.
what's happening at this point. It has gotten to the point it's eating my brain. All right. So I have an answer. And now I'm like, okay, fabulous. What do we do? He says, I have this protocol. It's 2 years long. 70% chance of success. I'm like, 70 is pretty good if you've been around or know anyone who's struggled with Lyme disease. The success rate of getting rid of that is not very good. So 70, I like that. And so we started on the protocol. He gave me the first set of like oral antibiotics. And it's a really complicated protocol. And there's rotating antibiotics, there are IV antibiotics, there are clearing IVs that he wants to give every couple of weeks because Lyme is super toxic. And it gets more toxic as time goes on. And when you kill it, it like jumps up the toxicity like 10
Yeah, because
times
it
because
sheds, right?
yeah, it just
Yep.
blows open and drops all of the toxin at once. So the clearing IVs are a real important part of this. And so looking at all of this stuff and running a calculator on it in my deteriorated state, I can't tell you the exact number because I never got the same total, but they all arrived around $27,000 to $28,000 for the first year. I'm in bankruptcy. My husband's making a third of what he normally does. There is no way I can pay for this. So let's call the insurance and see what they have to say. Called the insurance that day and explained the situation to the nice lady on the phone. And her exact words back to me are, "We don't believe in chronic Lyme." Well, isn't that fucking convenient for you?
Mhm.
And so, we kicked it around and I discovered they would pay for 2 months of oral antibiotics and then they were out. They were pulling the ripcord.
Mhm.
So the lion's share of this program is gonna be us paying for it out of our pockets, which we've already established is not a possibility. And I got a lesson in that moment on the questions that you ask. because when she said 2 months of oral antibiotics, I thought in my mind, well, shit, can it get any worse than this? You don't ever want the universe to answer that question for you. It's just no, don't ask that one. You're just inviting more trouble when you ask that question. And I got it immediately because as I'm getting off the phone with her, she says, "Oh, yes. And you need to know your doctor is no longer in network." Charming. So not even the doctor visits are going to be covered at this point. And that was a real low moment for me. And I sat down and I'm reviewing my options when I got off the phone with her. Insurance out of the picture. We're in bankruptcy. We can't get a loan. My husband's working full time and going to grad school full time. He's barely sleeping between that and taking care of me because I'm not able to carry my share of the household. What the frick are we going to do? We can't get a loan. We're in a bankruptcy. I can't get a job, which would be like the obvious choice. Because at this point, I went from just getting sick all the time and not being able to like tell him what happened earlier in the day to the point of I can't go into the kitchen to make a simple 30-minute meal in 30 minutes. It takes me 3 hours because I'm continually forgetting where I am and what I'm doing and having to figure it out over again before I can take the next step. And so to say that I'm not functional is a grand understatement. And I could think of only one other place to turn. And I'd been raised, as I mentioned, with some pretty strict parents, a Norwegian and a German to be specific. And I was told from a very early age, when you turn 18, you are responsible for your own self. Do not expect to move home into the basement. Don't call for loans. Don't do any of that because no, you're an adult and you will take care of your own stuff. And I lived my life that way. And up to this point, it had worked out fairly well. But I thought perhaps this one might be an exception. And so I called up and I talked to my father, and the bank of dad was empty. And so that night when we went to bed, I thought, what am I going to do? And my brain was like this trapped squirrel, bouncing off all of the walls over and over again. And my disease had gotten to the point where sleep wasn't a thing that was happening for me. My brain wasn't going through those normal processes anymore. And I had discovered that if I could meditate, I would feel a little bit better in the morning. It wasn't quite as good as going to sleep, but at least I felt more refreshed and not as strung out. And that night, there was no way I was meditating. I was continuing to go down all these dead ends of, well, maybe I can get a job, or maybe we can get a loan, or maybe, and there wasn't anything. And it was about 3 in the morning that I just stopped. I don't know if you want to call it surrender, but I just accepted that I did not have the answer. And in that moment of quiet and stoppage, it occurred to me that I might want to pray. Now, my childhood with the religion I was raised under, the God that they teach you about is not a pretty God. It's not a nice God. It's not a forgiving God. It's a very cruel and vindictive kind of God. And so I sat with that for a little while and I thought about that. And this is like the first moment where I started to separate the divine from the religious stuff I was taught. Because the religious stuff I was taught, that's not a God I'm willing to go talk to. But what I knew in my heart, and the thing that I got in trouble for when I was very young, was questioning things like, well, if God is love, why would he have you go and, wipe out another people to take over their land? Why would he ask you to sacrifice your only son to him? Why would he do any of that? That's just cruel and mean and terrible. Uh, and I especially don't think he's going to send somebody to hell because they were not exposed to our particular brand of Lutheranism. I mean, really?
Hmm.
A tiny fraction of all the people in the world. I just can't believe that. And in that moment, I decided I was going to pray to the God that I knew and understood. And so I said, God, I will do anything to get better. And I immediately got an answer to that prayer in the form of a very small voice in the back of my mind that said, really, anything? And the scientist went, whoa, the voice has a point. Anything is a very, very large commitment, and it doesn't have any edges on it. And so I thought about, well, what would be my limitations around that anything? And my limitations are I'm not going to kill someone. I'm not going to promote war. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to cheat. And I'm not going to steal from other people uh, because I believe in treating other people with respect. And none of that is in any way respectful. And then I thought about what I really know about God as opposed to the religious God I was trained about. And I came to the conclusion that I can promise anything to the God that I know and understand, who is loving and compassionate. And I decided I need to be very clear. So I said, God, for you, I will do anything. And I got my first miracle because I fell asleep, really, truly asleep for the first time in a month. And I woke in the morning with a clarity that I had to go get one of these clearing IVs, even though I had no idea how I would pay for it. And so I went in for the IV, and I'm sitting in the infusion room. And the doctor walks in the infusion room, which is not a place he normally goes at all. So I waved him over and explained the situation and what the insurance people had said. And he smiled. He got really excited when I told him insurance wasn't involved anymore. I'm like, okay. He says, you have all the choices now. Oh, good. So inform me of what my choices are. And he said, well, we have this naturopath herbalist who's on staff who has amazing success rates with parasitic infections, and Lyme is a parasitic infection. And so I think you should go see him and see what he has to say. He treats everything with herbs. The herbs are like $30 or $40 a bottle. And his appointments in the office are half the price of mine. I'm like, well, fabulous. That's a much more achievable kind of set of numbers, even though I don't know still how I'm going to reach those. And, the information always arrives at the point that you're ready to hear it. Because if I'd been presented with this option a few weeks earlier, I'd have went, absolutely not. Herbalism, it's all, it's all stories. We don't know for a fact that it works. They haven't done a bunch of studies on it, blah, 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 blah. It's not replicatable, all that stuff. So yeah, we've been running through all these walls. And so I go to see the herbalist who's running late that day. And there's a book in the waiting room. And since he's running late, I'm looking for something to do with myself. And the book says The Emotion Code on the front. Raised by a German and a Norwegian, I've been taught that you just don't have emotions. If you have emotions, you pretend you don't have emotions. You shove them way down and ignore them. And I'd spent a couple of decades in talk therapy trying to take the heat out of all of this repressed stuff. And while it was helpful to me in many ways, I was able to leave an abusive ex-husband. The heat around the original trigger remained. And so if this guy understood emotions, I wanted to understand emotions. And this is where I get sucked into the magical part of my journey. And I forget to tell people that the herbalist cured my Lyme disease in 3 months. So I will just throw that in there. Do not
Wow.
send me emails going, I have a cousin who this worked with. I don't need the information. It's gone. But I started working through this book, The Emotion Code, like it was an instruction manual. He would say, do this, I would go do this. And one of the main things that he used was muscle testing in that. which is something that I, as a scientist, was able to accept, right? Because it's a black box. And in science, what we call a black box is it's a process that we don't understand how it works, but it will replicate a result reliably. And so if you put X in, you will always get Y out of a black box process. And scientists are okay with that because it's replicatable. That's what makes it okay to us. So muscle testing, I could prove that it got me to truth. I could prove that it did not give me a false result. And so I was willing to do that. And I'm working through all of these trapped emotions, and it's helping. And so by the time I got to the chapter on heart walls, which I knew I had before I even muscle tested, um, I'm like, yeah, I think this is going to apply to me. And he made a good case to take down the heart wall, which I did. And as I'm methodically going through and taking down this heart wall, weird shit starts happening. That's my scientific description for it. I start seeing crossed over dead people. I start understanding why people are doing the things that they're doing. I'm a people watcher, and every now and again, you'll see somebody take an action that it's like, wow, I wonder what led them to the point in their life where that's the logical next choice. Well, because we always take what is to us the logical next choice. And I would ask that question in my mind, and I would be shown now why that was the logical next choice for them. And the scientist in me is losing her shit. It's like, you have much more brain damage than you realized. Your creativity is off into the stratosphere here. You're making up all kinds of things. This is a level of creativity you've never seen with some of these stories of these explanations. And so I'm discounting everything that's happening and writing it off. I said a prayer in Hebrew. I've never learned any Hebrew in my life. It just popped out of me. Scientist is like, well, I think you went to a Seder once when you were in college. You must have remembered it from that, right? No, but I'm reaching for any explanation I can get. And then I came home from the grocery store one day and I see my neighbor staggering under her husband's weight, trying to get him into the house. They're in their mid 80s. She's half the size of him. So the ice cream can melt. I go over and we help him into the house. And she's telling me that his kidney situation is so bad and she's scared for him and she's got to get an emergency appointment. I'm like, you just go do that. I'm going to stand here and keep him company. Don't you worry about a thing. And so she goes to get the doctor's appointment and I'm standing with her husband in the living room. And I know them both to be very devout people, some of the finest kind of religious people you can ever meet. They're generous and they're loving and compassionate and they help everyone and they don't judge anyone else's belief systems. I mean, the best religious people you can meet. They have that one-on-one relationship with the divine. And he closes his eyes. I can see his lips are moving and I feel really awkward just watching him do this. So I went ahead and closed my eyes, and in my mind's eye, I saw this little tiny flame. It looked like a pilot light that's on the edge of going out, dancing and flickering. And so I said, can we do something about that? I haven't acknowledged who I even asked that question of. The scientist certainly did not ask that question, because the scientist would tell you kidney disease is a one-way trip down and out of this world. But some part of me felt there was possibility there. And the instant I asked that question, it roared up into like this great big bonfire. I don't know how big it got because he dropped my hands and my eyes whipped open. And he looks at me and says, "Are you a healer?" And I'm looking around to see who he's talking to because this has not entered my reality ever. And I was saved from having to respond because his wife came in saying that she'd gotten the appointment, but they had to leave right now. Hustle him out into the car. And I hid in my house for 2 days while the scientists convinced me that nothing had happened and that I was a crappy neighbor I'm a good Midwestern girl, and when your neighbors are in distress, you shovel their sidewalk, you bring over casserole, you do these things. I hadn't done any of those things, so I guilted myself next door and fully convinced that she was planning a funeral or would be, like, in the ICU on a death wash. And I tapped on the door. She opened the door with a smile. It's like, "Okay, so it might be neither of these things." And she invites me in and says, "I'm so glad you're here because Jay has so many questions." And my stomach, like, sunk through my feet because I've got 0 answers. I've convinced myself nothing has happened. I walk into the living room, and there he is looking fat and happy. He's kicked back in his Barcalounger. He's got his drink and his remote and his book, and he's looking fat and happy. "How you doing, Jay?" He says, "It was the weirdest thing. By the time I got to the doctor, I was feeling pretty good, and they ran all the usual battery of tests, and my kidney function came back normal. Not improved, normal. And it's been decades since he's had any kind of remotely close to normal kidney function." And that was the moment when the scientist had to sit down and shut the fuck up and began to look at the events that had been happening over the past couple of weeks in a very different light and recognize that perhaps this is the anything that I agreed to. So that's how I woke up. I went kicking and screaming and fighting all the way.
So beautiful. Wow. It's yeah, you closed off your gifts at a young age, and you kept getting little reminders throughout. When you didn't listen, you got the major one, and then at that point, surrender. And then, when we're fighting our truest self, we're always going to run into problems and obstacles. And then when we open up to it, the abundance, the beauty of life, the fulfillment, the purpose all flows in. It's gorgeous to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. I think one of the things, though, that I like to share with people is that life will continue to be life after you wake up. The world doesn't fundamentally change how it approaches you. You just have better tools to work with it when it shows up. And
Yeah.
it does become completely amazing and magical in a lot of ways, but life continues to bring things to you. It's not like that process stops. But when life brings you things and you step into it with love and curiosity for how this is going to unfold, it unfolds in ways that you could have never with your mind anticipated. And
Yeah.
that's where the magic shows up.
Absolutely. One of the things you say in your podcast is talking about living soul first. What does that
Yes.
mean to you?
What that means to me is when I am in a situation when life has occurred, right? Because I'm human, I do still have this reaction of, "Oh my God, I can't believe," right? It's like this terrible setback. What I do, though, is I catch myself and I go, "Okay, human, I've had my reaction. I'm going to set it aside and get curious. And then I'm going to allow for quiet, peaceful space for my intuition, for my higher self to talk to me about what this is about and what my next optimal action is going to be." Um, as opposed to allowing the logical mind to lead me down a path, because the logical mind always thinks it has the right answer, and it's usually totally the wrong answer.
Hmm.
And so that's what I mean by living soul first. It's allowing that intuitive stuff to arrive and not just acknowledging it, but acting on the intuitive hit after I've asked my mind to take a seat.
What are some of the things that we can do? A lot of people ask me is like, how do I tap more into my intuition? So for people that, are looking to develop this, so quote unquote muscle of intuition, how can you guide them in terms of getting more in touch with listening and being able to understand, comprehend, and connect with that?
It's a righteous cycle as opposed to a negative self-reinforcing cycle, and so what you want to do is you want to actively invite the intuition at every decision point that you possibly can, and it's a building of trust, so frequently, it's best to start with something small, right? like, what's the best path to go to the grocery store? This was one that I practiced early on. It's like, should I go right or left to go to the grocery store? My mind knows what the shortest path to the grocery store is, but that's maybe not always the optimal path. There may be a reason for you to go a different direction. And so building trust with going the intuitive direction. And one of the things that unfolded for me as I was going through this process, right? Because the brain thinks, well, it should be more efficient. It should, directly benefit me in some fashion. And what I discovered when I started going places by using this, should I go left or right, was I was almost always sent past trouble, if you will, quote unquote. Somebody who is in a moment that is difficult for them. There's a car accident, there's an ambulance in front of their house, there's a fire truck, whatever it is. And so I would be sent past these places and I would ask, am I to stop and render assistance or what it is? And oftentimes I was not to stop at all. But what I was to do was just to share love and compassion onto that situation as I drove past it, which meant I started arriving instead of early or on time, perhaps a little bit late to places. And after a bunch of that had happened, I started kind of asking my spiritual guides, because we all have spiritual guides. It's like a moonshot. You've got Houston is over there. There's help available to you. So I started asking, it's like, okay, so why am I being sent past all of these places? And why am I not arriving on time or early like my rational mind wants me to? And I was told that my energy was what was required there. The fact that I do send love and compassion and blessings to the situations makes a difference in how they play out. And I was also shared that I will never miss anything that's intended for me by doing this. And looking back on those circumstances, I have to say that that's the case, because even in the times where I arrived late, and I'm like texting people from the car, it's like, I'm stuck in traffic and it's going to be, I don't know, 20 minutes or something. I'm going to be late. Please be patient with me. When I arrived, it was always the perfect time for the people on the other end as well, because something else had happened for them and they were also arriving late, or there was a delay in starting, whatever event it was. It always worked out perfectly. And so I started to share what I consider mantras with myself, right? Because the mind wants to get in there and go, you're going to be late again. This is terrible, blah, 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 blah. And so I would counter that with, there's always exactly enough time. I always arrive exactly in the moment that's perfect. And it helps to kind of counter that kind of brain insistence that, oh, well, you didn't do whatever. Well, I may not have arrived at the originally agreed upon time, but I always let people know when I would be arriving, and it always turned out to be the perfect moment. So I'm learning. I'm in the process of unlearning this, you must always be 100% punctual.
Mm-hmm.
And I've moved it into just communicate and
That's what it is. That's
arrive.
all people want when you're
Yeah.
running late. It's just, hey, I'm running 2 minutes late. I'm running 5 minutes late. Whatever it is, it's like being in integrity, and then also not judging yourself, because things do happen which require your attention. But having the right consciousness behind the situation, and not being too hard on yourself about it.
Yeah, exactly. And it all serves me in some way. I just don't always, with my logical mind, understand the math, the karmic
Mhm.
math, if you will.
For sure. For sure. I wanted to focus a little bit about your work that you do and how you help others. Can you tell us a little bit about your conscious enlightenment process?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things that I do. One is conscious enlightenment, and the other is I have an Activate Your Spiritual Superpowers workshop. And that will be coming up here in December. The conscious enlightenment process is one-on-one work with me. And basically, I take all of the modalities that I now have at my fingertips, because I went out and got a pile of them, because I'm a troubleshooter at heart. And if you've ever been someone who solves those kinds of problems, having the right tool in the moment makes all the difference.
Yeah, combining the
And
spiritual with the biophysicist
yes,
mentality.
exactly.
Yeah,
The logic,
it's a very unique
the trained scientists
combination.
solve the problem. Yes, it actually works out remarkably well. You would think
Hmm.
totally anathema, but no. And so a lot of the people who come to me for the conscious enlightenment process have what do I want to say? They've run into a problem in the physical world that they can't solve by conventional means. They've tried all the things. When I talk to them, they're like, "Yeah, I've seen all the doctors, I've seen all the professionals. I've I've talked to lawyers about this legal thing that's going on, and there's been like zero resolution." And so that's the kind of thing that tends to send people my direction because it's at that moment that it becomes mission critical to solve whatever it is going on. And it's become clear it's not a mundane problem. It's going to take some kind of an extra solution, extra sensory, outside spiritual solution. And so that's the moment in which people are like, okay, I've tried all the things. Now I'm willing to try this. And I approach it in a structured manner and yet an intuitive manner. So, what I do is I gather all the information on what's going on. I read your soul contract to understand what it is you came here to do and the challenges you came to overcome and the things that motivate you, the skills you brought with you. We put all that in a pile. And then we talk to your body because your soul will speak to you through your physicality.
Hmm.
And I have you check in with your body. There'll be a part that's talking to you and will intuitively bring forward the stuff that's up for you. And then we'll find the right tool in the toolbox to deal with what that is. And then we'll ask your body, okay, what's next? And your soul will talk to you again through your physicality. And we'll just iterate that process until we've picked it apart.
Yeah, wonderful. It's exactly the process of how you got to where you are. Hearing your amazing story about hitting all these walls throughout life, but not giving up and just like looking at it as an opportunity, whether subconsciously or consciously we're thinking of that at the time. Obviously, it's frustrating when we feel like there's nothing we can move forward to. But then once you got the awareness to, okay, now let's check in with my emotions, check in with my body, and unravel those walls that are the inner walls compared to the outer walls. You unravel those first, and then things started flowing for you. So for you to be able to have this life story, this energetic blueprint of who you are as a beautiful soul, and being able to help other people in the same manner kind of unravel their superhero powers like you of course describes. It's very powerful work, and I know it's not easy. And I really appreciate you and others that that dedicate your lives to doing such things.
Yeah. You asked me how I became Sophia, and I love that you asked it that way. I think your superconscious was probably talking to you because I was not given that name at birth. That was a name that came to me after my awakening because I'd never liked my name all the way through my life. Absolutely hated all aspects of my name. And my middle name was the worst. And so after I awoke, I'm like, okay, I want some insight into this. And what is my real name? Because I know this isn't my real name. And so my real name arrived. I'm like, yay. Now I have it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I wanted to acknowledge your own intuitiveness in asking that question because that story is literally how I became Zofia.
Yeah, it's like when you're just open to the universe and flowing of information, because a lot of times I don't, I prepare for my podcast, but also I really try to be present and look at the person in the eyes, and then the questions, the conversations, they do come, and certain things that I say I might not know about the person, but they're like, oh wait, how did you. So it's very interesting. I want to thank you so much for coming on. If you had to sum it up in a sentence, why did you come here to planet Earth? Why did you choose to come here as planet Earth, as Sophia? And what did you want to experience?
Oh, that's a much longer I can't really be summed up in a sentence because I didn't choose. I was in some ways chosen.
Mhm.
And I think it is to simply be love, to be that example of connection, that example of how you negotiate in both worlds at the same time. I don't think it's an accident that I have this amazing intellect that wants to drive the bus. I think I was here to show people how you can be both at the same time, both intuitive and logical, rational.
Wow, what a gift to anyone who works with you and is able to kind of unlock that within themselves. Because yeah, life becomes, I won't say easier, but it becomes more fulfilling and purposeful, and kind of step away, zoom out a little bit. And like each situation is not the be all and all of our life. It's just a flow of the process, or a turn in the river. So it's part of the whole grand scheme. So, a lot of times we get into situations and we're like, oh man, oh my goodness, my life is falling apart. My relationship broke up, or I lost this job. Zoom out a little bit. You're here because you've overcome everything that's happened to you in the past. And when you start learning to live in this flow of perspective, abundance, and love, then the journey becomes a lot more fun. And that's the juice of life, is the journey, not the destination.
Yeah. Well, and that's where happiness is found. Happiness is found right here in this moment, regardless of what the external circumstances are in this moment. You can choose at any point to be more optimistic, more hopeful, more joyful, more curious. Any of those things are within your power to select. You do not have to go down that default reactionary chain of emotions unless you choose to. And there's some value to allowing those emotions, because when you just allow them, they pass through very quickly. It's when you try to resist them or pretend they're not there that you end up in this locked in struggle with them.
Yeah, definitely. How can we learn more about you?
Oh, I have two doorways into Zofia land. The first one, if you just kind of want to poke around the edges and get to know me a little bit, I would suggest going through the What is Your Number One Spiritual Superpower quiz. And that can be found at superpowerquiz.us. And it will tell you a little bit more about who you are, your giftedness, the main reason you came into this world. And then you can hang out and see what Zofia is about. And the other one is more for the people who are in that moment of dark night of the soul struggle. I've tried everything and it's just not working right. I do a 20-minute consult, and it is quite literally a consult. You leave with a plan to attack whatever it is that's going on for you. One of the options that you leave with is working with me one-on-one, although that's not the only option you're provided with. And you can find that at bookzofiacoffeechat.com. That's BOOKZOFIA coffeechat.com.
Awesome. The audience is going to love this podcast. Can't wait till it releases. And thank you so much again for coming on and
All
enlightening
right.
us.
Thank you so much for flowing with me.